We are back to begin the discussion with you of literature, what every Catholic should know, by the renowned author Joseph Pearce, who's with us as usual. If he disappears and you see a question mark, he will reappear. If he disappears and you see a question mark, we will continue discussing among ourselves until he reappears. So he's a mystery man.
Yeah, and he has an inquiring mind, so that's why the question mark.
Yeah, the question mark is when I wander off to ponder because I don't know the answer, and I come back when I'm ready. That's what it is.
Yes.
Very good.
Yeah.
Can we do? I need to get a question mark on our screen here. All right. So we're going to discuss the first six chapters of this book. Right at the very beginning, you asked the question, Joseph, why should every Catholic know about literature? And we really covered that in detail at our last session, our general session. But you do, on page 2, break up the history of the West into 3 periods: the pre-Christian or pagan period, Christendom, and what you call the Age of Disenchantment, which of course others have called the Enlightenment. But I think it's fair to break up history into those areas. At least we can use that as a format for discussing the literature. I want to say one thing about the Age of Disenchantment. There's another book, as I said last week, really good books lead you to other really good books. And it's a lifetime of work, but it's a lifetime of joy as well, and a lifetime of become part of the larger human community. We published a book years ago and republished it a number of times. This is the old cover. I don't have a copy with the new cover on it. It's called Chance or the Dance by a friend of Joseph's and ours, Thomas Howard. And it actually talks about what the Enlightenment Act did. It replaced the medieval view of man and the ancient view of man, in which all of the cosmos was a dance with a chain of being interlinked and one thing always referring to another. That's the dance with chance. Particles that are just moving, in random ways and interacting, and it's nothing really means anything else. And so if you want to understand what Joseph means by disenchantment, then I think this is a key book. I mean, it's a book that should be on everybody's reading list. Eric Metaxas, who's a very prominent Protestant radio host and writer, thinks this book is one of the best he's ever read.
And he wrote the foreword to our newest edition.
That's right. So I recommend that. All right.
Yeah, may I just say something about sort of the terminology we're going to use? Obviously, you're correct. I can't use the word enlightenment without prefixing it with superciliously self-named, because obviously it's the name it gives to itself. So I thought disenchantment is a more correct term for what we're seeing here. But the other thing, and this is somewhat, I think needs pointing out, and I know that some people won't agree with this. For me, Christendom is the mystical body of Christ moving through time. It's not just something connected to politics in the Middle Ages. So what I say in the book is I see the age of disenchantment and the age of Christendom actually living side by side. And so the Catholic revival in literature, the various Catholic revivals in the art are an example of Christendom living on in the age of disenchantment. So I don't like the idea of, a post-Christian age. Well, in some senses, yes, we live in a disenchanted age. That's a sort of the divorcee that walks away from Christ. But on another hand, the mystical body of Christ continues to move through history, creating all sorts of beautiful things that bring people to Christ. And I think it's important that terminology that I use is sort of understood.
Is it fair to say, Joseph, that there was a period in which Christendom was the dominant culture in the West, and others were subcultures, but now that's kind of reversed, where the culture of disenchantment or the culture of relativism or the culture of enlightened reason has become the dominant culture, with the Christendom becoming a subculture? Can I say that? I can say it, but I mean, is it true?
Yeah, you can say that, and I think it's true, but only up to a point. Because what I talk about also in this opening chapter is that there are three aspects of what it is to be a human that play themselves out in literature. One is Homo viator, so journeying man, man on the quest, the life story which we were talking about last week. The other is Anthropos, and I actually was you, Father, back in the summer program we did together at Ave Maria University in the old days, in the good old days. You first brought my attention to Plato's understanding of the etymology of anthropos, the uplooker, he who looks up. So there's the Homo viator, there's anthropos, but the other aspect is Homo superbus, the proud man, and this sin of pride besets all of us in all generations. So I think those three aspects of who we are, that's true of the age of Christendom. So politics still stunk. There were still, Machiavellian rulers that paid lip service to the church, but in practice were diabolical, even in the age of Christendom. So, I think one thing that the mistakes we got to avoid is to be a progressive who sees a golden age in the future, but also to be a sort of an idealistic, romantic traditionalist who sees a golden age in the past. And I think both of those are oversimplistic ways of seeing things.
I want to make a comment on the words because it's true. Anthropos from ana, meaning up, and tropos, meaning turned. So Homo sapiens is the animal that's not on 4 feet looking at the ground, but looking up. But I hadn't thought about it. You just talked about it here. Superbus, what does that come from? Super. It means over. And so instead of looking up, Homo superbus is the man who thinks he's up there himself. He's on top. No, we're not on top. We got to be down looking up.
Right, absolutely. So the whole of my approach to literature in this whole book is really rooted in an understanding those three aspects of who we are play themselves out in the great works of literature. The Anthropos, Homo viator, and Homo superbus, and often we're all three. Now, these aren't different people. This is actually playing itself out in the battlefield, which is our own heart.
David, any thoughts?
That's a very important point. And I really appreciate your point about not being nostalgic about some golden age in the past, because anyone who really does read Chaucer cover to cover,
Yeah.
okay, what you're going to see is the same old sinfulness and corrupt clergy. And in fact, anyone wringing their hands right now about how bad the church is right now, it would be a good idea to read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and in the general prologue, of course, there's only, amidst all this really corrupt clergy and laity, there's only one, the poor parson of a town is the only priest who actually practices what he preaches.
Right.
The rest are all corrupt.
They're all
And
a
the
mess.
plowman, his brother, is a holy layman. Now, there were one or two others are bad, the knight and the student, the clerk of Oxenford, so there's an element of others that are okay. But really, you get an idealized layman and the idealized clergyman, and the rest are just a heap of expletives.
So, yes, so I don't know. We probably don't want to jump there now, but I have something else to say about that parson when we get there.
Well, I'll come back when we're on that topic.
Okay.
It'll be a week after this. Okay.
No, that's in this chapter. That's.
I'm
I don't
sorry.
want to jump. I don't want to jump. I don't want to jump to the medievals. Right. Where do we want to go next?
Joseph.
Well, I've actually, I presume, perhaps presumptuously, Homo superbus, that perhaps as I wrote the book, that I would let you decide what we're going to talk about.
Well, okay. Then, well, I think what we should do is just briefly touch on the people in this section that you think are important, starting with Homer.
Okay.
You mentioned the Iliad, you mentioned the Odyssey. And again, I would like to point out that while there are these universal themes, man as a pilgrim, men at war, and what happens when that. But, there is a lot of human sin, bloodlust, corruption, power hungry. I mean, throughout Homer, right? I mean, it's not as though you're just going to see good men acting well, right? So why do we read him? I mean, I know why I read him, but I think it's a good question to answer. Some people will say, oh, this Achilles versus Hector, they're all killing machines, these guys. Why should a Christian read these guys? And I think we should, but I'd like to know why you think we should. Joseph?
Well, I think that I disagree with certain types of people, certainly classicists, a certain type of, shall we say, disenchanted classicist that wants Homer to be very different from Christianity. And therefore, they're
Yeah.
looking for the non-Christian elements in Homer. But in actual fact, if you take Homer at his own words, you get someone is, if you might say, desirous of Christianity. It's that noble pagan who's looking towards a better way of doing things. So, for instance, in the Iliad, Homer commits the crime that in every single creative writing class, you'll be told, don't give away the plot on the opening page. But Homer, of course, in the Iliad says, sing muse, in other words, help me, the giver of the gift of creativity,
Mm-hmm.
to tell of Achilles' anger and its destructiveness and the will of Zeus, which is accomplished. So we're told right at the very beginning, you have a sinful man whose anger is a product of his pride, and pride proceeds to fall because it's the will of God, right? I mean, this is not anything which is that different from a Christian understanding of reality.
Right. Right. I'm just saying that why are they all fighting anyway? Well, they know very well that if they take the city, they'll all go home with booty. Why is Achilles angry? He's angry because Agamemnon has taken his sex slave and on
Right.
it goes. So, I mean, none of these guys are paragons of virtue, okay? Unless you now look at what the Greeks mean by virtue: virtue, manly excellence. And then Homer, I agree with you, he does see an even higher standard for judging even in their culture what a truly great man is. What were you going to say,
I
Father?
want to comment on this, and I'm going to indulge myself in a long quote from G.K. Chesterton. And if you people are watching this, not live but recorded, you can fast forward if you want. But this is from Everlasting Man, which is a book which everybody should read and read more than once. I'll hold it up briefly, but I mean, I've got my volume 2 here of the collected works. We sell it as an individual volume, but this volume 2 is hardback, and it also includes Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas by GKC, which are also worth reading. But in any event, this is a classic book, probably his best book.
Yeah.
But he talks about Homer in the chapter called The Antiquity of Civilization. He says this, he says, when all is said, if there was nothing in the world but what was said and done and written and built in the lands lying around of a trade. Oops, no, that's not the page I want. Oh, sorry about this. This is on page 211. That was another good quote, but it's too long. 211. Somewhere along the Ionian coast opposite Crete, so that's Asia Minor, in the islands was a town of some sort, probably the sort we should call a village or hamlet with a wall. It was called Ilion, which is where we get the name Iliad, but it came to be called Troy, and the name will never perish from the earth. A poet who may have been a beggar and a ballad monger, who may have been unable to read and write, and was described by tradition as blind, composed a poem about the Greeks going to war with this town to recover the most beautiful woman in the world.
Helen.
That the most beautiful woman in the world lived in that one little town sounds like a legend. That the most beautiful poem in the world was written by somebody who knew nothing larger than such a little town is a historical fact. It is said that the poem came at the end of the period, that the primitive culture brought it forth in its decay, in which case one would like to have seen that culture in its prime. But anyhow, it is true that this, which is our first poem, might very well be our last poem too. It might well be the last word as well as the first word spoken by man about his mortal lot, as seen by merely mortal vision, so without Christendom, If the world becomes pagan again and perishes, the last man left alive would do well to quote the Iliad and die. I mean, that's how powerful he thinks this is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But in this one great human revelation of antiquity, there's another element of great historical importance which has hardly, I think, been given its proper place in history. The poet has so conceived the poem that his sympathies, apparently, and those of his reader certainly, are on the side of the vanquished rather than the victors. You're about these people that, pride and everything, and there's no real, heroism. But in a certain sense, Hector
Yeah.
is the hero, the vanquished one. And he says, the name anticipates all the defeats through which our race and religion were to pass. That survival of 100 defeats, that is his triumph. And so there's the thing in Homer, this book where before Christ comes, you see the victory of the cross. You see the victory of humility that is in the battle seems to have lost it, but in fact, there's something, the glory shines through. And so finally, at the end of this chapter, a later legend, an afterthought but not an accident, said that stragglers from Troy founded a republic in the Italian shore. So who is Virgil going to take as the hero from the Iliad in order to found the culture of Rome? Not Achilles, not Agamemnon. It's going to be Hector's son. Aeneas, yeah. It was true in spirit that republican virtue had such a root, a mystery of honor that was not born of Babylon, which is the sign of pride in Asia, or Egyptian pride, which is African pride. Egypt's in the continent of Africa. There shone like the shield of Hector, defying Asia and Africa, till the light of a new day was loosened with the rushing of the eagles and the coming of the name that came like a thunderclap when the world woke up to Rome. So it's incredible how Chesterton sees here in Homer, the Iliad, and the Aeneid by Virgil, this prefigurement of the
Christian. I think he sees in Homer a proto-Christianity. And let's get one thing straight about Hector here, right? So, it begins about Achilles, and what's the moral about Achilles? His anger, which is a consequence of his pride, is destructive and is punished by Zeus, punished by God. But who's the hero at the end? Hector. Who's Hector? Not merely the vanquished, but the blameless one, right? Because Paris is the one who commits the original sin with Helen and elopes. Paris comes to Troy, bringing the curse of adultery with him, which is what's going to be punished. And we see a couple of speeches in the Iliad where Hector calls Paris the cause of the problem. He's crazy. He's women crazy. It's your fault. We're all going to die because of you. And often, that Hector is described as blameless Hector. All right, he's the innocent victim of somebody else's sin, and so is his wife and son. Right. So we see here a real meditation on how the innocent suffer as a consequence of the evil of sin. So, I really think Homer, I think there was a golden age of Greek philosophy before the golden age of Greek philosophy, because I think we see the fruits of it in Homer.
Well, Hector, whose motive for fighting is to defend his family and home.
Right.
That's why he's innocent compared with the loot-hungry Greeks. I mean, it's true Agamemnon's wife was stolen from him, but let's face it, he gets these guys to go to war with him because if the city falls, they'll all get the loot. So Hector, you're right, and the fact that Hector's side loses, the losing side, Chesterton's seeing this beautiful connection to the Christian understanding of victory through failure. And that brings us up to the Aeneid, because you're right. Yeah. It's Aeneas, the survivor of the fall of Troy, who then goes off to found Rome. So we should move on to Virgil now, right? And talk about the Aeneid. It's a very short little section here, but was there something in particular?
Well, I don't do the Aeneid justice, really. That one thing you have to do in a book like this is to pick and choose. And I spent quite a lot of time in the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. What I mainly do is to focus on the story of Aeneas and Dido, because I think it's one of those. What Virgil's doing is teaching us the danger of following lustful passions, following our feelings, rather than fulfilling our responsibility to God and to homeland. So, in the end, that Aeneas has to be visited by a messenger from the gods, by an angel, who actually wakes him up out of his, lustful appetites when he's betrayed his destiny to found Rome. He's betrayed his son, whose destiny is to rule Rome. He's betrayed his parents. And as for Dido, she's also building Carthage, and she betrays her people and the building of the city because of this obsessive, passionate relationship with Aeneas. So I think that's a very, very powerful, timeless, perennial story that Virgil tells, and that's what I focus on in the Aeneid.
Yeah, the epithet which he has kept for 2,000 years is pious Aeneas, not in the sense of pious, but pious really means having filial piety. And so, what you just said, Joseph, that he abandons his father, his destiny, his son, and his heritage for the private indulgence of intimacy with Dido, but he repents of that. He hears the call. He recognizes he made a mistake, and there's a great lesson of conversion in the whole life of Aeneas and the Roman virtue. I mean, that's one thing that Rome stood for, even though it didn't follow like we don't either. But the idea of virtue and duty is something which had to be primary.
Well,
Yes.
let's not forget that the gods of Carthage were very different from the gods of Greece and Rome. With that powerful scene of Aeneas fleeing the burning city, he's got his father on his back, and he's got the gods, the hearth gods, in his cloak with his son by the hand. It's this beautiful image. This is what's leaving Troy. But you're right. There's this big sidetrack, this romance with Dido, but later on, Rome and Carthage are going to be pitted to the death, right? These two civilizations.
And that's obviously in Virgil's mind when he's talking about this relationship.
Absolutely.
It's a destructive relationship.
We might talk about works of his justification, not in a bad sense, but works of Virgil. The original founding myth of Rome was Romulus and Remus, right? This is a later founding myth written during the reign of Caesar Augustus to sort of validate Rome's dominance of the world. And so, yes, he's got the Carthage conflict in his mind for sure, but so does Chesterton in Everlasting Man, when Chesterton is comparing, imagine if these other empires had won, Persia or Carthage or whatever, we would have never had the Christendom that we're going to talk about.
Very, very different world.
The war, the gods and the demons.
That's right.
That the Roman household gods versus Baal and Moloch who ate the children.
Because Carthage worshipped Baal, which was the infant sacrifice, and which was anathema to the Greeks and Romans, even if they had.
And there's an element of that cult of death even in the story of Aeneas and Dido, because Dido's response to the relationship ending is hatred and self-annihilation, suicide, right? Culture of death. So how do we respond when our passions run away with us and we can't indulge them any longer? Do we actually repent and move on towards a more virtuous alternative, or do we say to hell with it all and just basically self-annihilate, just this culture of death, this culture of suicide? And Dido, I think, represents that alternative view of things.
Right. Well, speaking of more drama and death and so on, let's go to Sophocles. Yeah, because I noticed. Okay, we talked about the innocence of Hector. I don't know if you'll let me jump in here with the so-called innocence of Oedipus, because Joseph, you quote here on page 21, Oedipus, a Job-like figure, more sinned against than sinning. And I just want to push on that just a little bit, because
Please, makes it interesting.
The whole trilogy, they're tragedies, right? You can tell a play is a tragedy when there are a lot of dead bodies at the end. That's how you tell a play is a tragedy. And these tragedies of Sophocles, what we are seeing is the sins of the father passing on. Oedipus, I don't see him as not a sinner, okay? Even though it's been prophesied that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, and he spends a good deal of his time fleeing the fulfillment of this prophecy, afraid of himself that this will come to pass. The fact is he's along the road has a little road rage and kills a stranger, and that does turn out to be his father. And when he goes to the town and marries the widow, that does turn out to be his mother. But I just want to look at that initial, in spite of the fact that he knew the prophecy, in spite of the fact that he spent so much time trying not to fulfill the prophecy, he gets into a quarrel, loses his temper, and kills a man. It's a crime of passion. So I don't think, I'm not an expert, but I don't see here a man completely without sin. I see a man with a tragic flaw, which, by the way, his daughter Antigone, for all of her righteousness, shall we say, is a little rash, right? We're seeing the sins of the father working out through the generations. Anyway, I throw that out for your comment.
Yeah, well, good. I mean, I love an argument, and it's never going to become a quarrel between this triumvirate here. But let me just make a few things clear here. That the conclusion of the Oedipus cycle is Oedipus at Colonus.
Yes.
And at the end of Oedipus at Colonus, we see a very wise and serene Oedipus who has gained wisdom through his experience of suffering.
Yes,
And
he has.
And is mystically assumed into heaven. It's actually we have the Feast of the Assumption was recently, but we actually see some sort of mystical assumption into heaven as the reward of the gods for a man who's gained wisdom through suffering. And I would also, I think it's important. I don't say that Oedipus is without sin. I say he's more sinned against than sinning. It's not the same thing. That's very important. And and in that, when he kills the man who turns out to be his father, it wasn't unprovoked. Yes, he does get angry, but he actually the main culprit was the father who provokes him, right? And he responds. So he's not blameless, absolutely not blameless. And I think so we have to realize is that Sophocles writes Antigone when he's a young man, and you see this of idealism of what we would now call subsidiarity of the rights of the individual and the family with religious liberty against the power of the state. And this not naive, but this idealism, right, which plays itself out with the martyrdom of Antigone. But you say she could be guilty of rashness. But then we have the more mature work, which is Oedipus Rex, where really there's a meditation on what about, because in at the beginning of the Odyssey, Homer has Zeus say that the mortals blame us for their suffering, even though they, through their recklessness, of course, suffering beyond that which is given. And that's the really profound thing. Some suffering is given. In other words, some suffering is a gift. It's not merely a consequence of this. So even Homer's asking the very profound things. And I think that's what Sophocles is doing. What happens if all sorts of suffering happens to someone? That's why I do make the parallel with Job, right? Also something which, at least largely, is not their fault. How do you make sense of this? And of course, in the play, so Oedipus Rex, we don't make sense of it because it ends very tragically with him plucking out his own eyes, etc.
Yeah, because he'd been blind, so now he's going to make himself blind, right? I mean, the imagery here is very powerful.
Yeah, but then we also have the Tiresias issue, the wisdom, doesn't need physical eyes, right? Because there's some sight that transcends physical eyesight. So he actually gains vision in the final play, Oedipus at Colonus, as a blind man, as Tiresias does, etc. At the end, we do see, and this, of course, this is written later, whether Sophocles himself could see this when he wrote Oedipus Rex, or whether it's something Sophocles came to see as an old man, is open to discussion. But certainly the last play, which unfortunately is the least known, is an old man's meditation upon the wisdom to be gleaned, or the wisdom to be had from the acceptance and embrace of suffering, which is one of the most universal lessons any of us can learn, of course.
That's right. And that's why we should all be reading it. Back to our question, why should we read this old stuff, right? Because this is just perennial human experience, perennial human wisdom that comes through. And yes, so great. I think we've got a point of agreement here on this. Do you have something to say to that, Father?
No, let's move on. I mean, it's pretty good, but we're running out of time here.
Or should we just run to Dante? Because if we're going to talk about the purification that comes through suffering, why don't we go straight to Dante? Because that's really what that is about, isn't it? I love it, Joseph, that you say it's too bad most students stop at Inferno, because if you don't get to go through the purgation that suffering can permit and bring about, you won't get to paradise. And so you kind of miss the whole point of the work if you only read Inferno.
Okay.
Yeah, the analogy I use in the book is that, you know, if someone were to say to you that I've read the Lord of the Rings because I've read the Fellowship of the Ring, you'd say that's ridiculous, right? You've only read 1/3 of the book. Well, the Divine Comedy is not 3 books, right? It's 1 book. The
That's
whole
right.
purpose of the descent into hell is so, having gone down, you can now ascend, right? So to only do the descent without the ascent is it's absolutely absurd. And it's ironic, of course, that the modern world is at home in hell, which is why it's the only thing it's ever taught, but doesn't understand purgatorial suffering or the communion of the saints. So that's why, but for Catholics, there's no excuse at all for Catholics not reading the whole thing, even if, you know, Protestants don't understand purgatory, and you know, secularists only understand hell.
Well, okay, you can jump over Beowulf if you want, which is fine. I think we should, but I want
Just in the
to
interest of time.
go to our readers here, our listeners. I mean, what he says about this early medieval literature is very important, and Beowulf is a perfect example, Chris Palmer and so on. I mean, these are things everybody should read, Okay, on to Dante, back to Dante. Well, we pretty
Well,
much
or
covered
we
Dante.
can now go to
Chaucer?
Chaucer. If we're, I mean, I think you covered Dante beautifully.
Want me to
Yeah, I know, I'm happy. I'm happy.
Say
As I
one
said,
thing about Beowulf.
No, about Dante. I was going to say that it's like Shakespeare too. It's not an easy read. You just don't pick up Dante, and sit in the corner and read that. You have to know read the footnotes. And I think Joseph, you're right. Dorothy Sayers still has the best footnotes, and
Yeah.
I like her Terzarima too. I mean, I think Dorothy
yeah,
Sayers is a genius. But I mean, some things require work. Lord of the Rings, not as much because it's written in a contemporary language. Most of the words are one syllable in Lord of the Rings. But if you want to read beautiful literature of the past, it's going to take an effort, but it's worth the effort. That's the whole
Yes.
thing. And if you can't do it by yourself, get some friends and do it. And you don't have to bite it off all at once either. But again, don't stop at the purgatory. I mean, at hell. Get at least a purgatory. All right,
Yeah.
on to Chaucer then.
Yeah. Chaucer. So yes,
We were talking about
Tales of Ribaldry. I mean, if you read the whole thing, you will really get some pretty colorful stories that'll make you blush. And but the thing I wanted to bring to your attention that's not mentioned in here, the parson, who, as you said, is the only good cleric in the group, right? The parson is the good cleric, and the is it the farmer who's the
plowman.
yeah, the
The
plowman
plowman.
who's the good layman, and so Chaucer's sort of setting these up as ideals, and everybody
And
else.
they're brothers, and that's obviously deliberate. The
Yeah,
plowman is
they're brothers. That's right.
Arthur's
I
brother.
forgot that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Chaucer also wrote The Parson's Tale, which is really a homily on the 7 deadly sins. And most editions of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales does not include it. And what Chaucer does is, after you get through these tales of ribaldry, at the end, he kind of apologetically says, these are kind of dirty stories, and I've probably made you laugh at the wrong things, but now I'm going to make it up for you by giving you the parson's sermon on the 7 deadly sins. And now what you see is that the whole thing was a meditation on the 7 deadly sins. And
Yeah.
so I'm just going to encourage the audience here that if they can ever get their hands on the parson's sermon, to read it along with the rest of the tales.
Yeah, and the modern world doesn't like that because they see it as preachy, but it is Chaucer's moral. And you're right about the ribaldry and the bawdiness, and some things, yeah, will make you blush. And certainly, I know, as someone who's taught literature for many years at college level, that there are some tales you just would not teach because for various reasons. But even those, like the Miller's Tale, for instance, the actual, regardless of the ribaldry and bawdiness, there's actually there's a good Christian moral to the story. The trouble is, of course, most of us are somewhat embarrassed by the means by which Chaucer gets to the end.
Yeah.
very good. Well, let's go out and read Chaucer's tales then, and For next week, we're going to take the same book, literature, what every Catholic should know, chapters 7 through 13.
So we'll be getting into the Renaissance.
Renaissance, yes.
Yeah, so we're basically covering the periods from, yes, Thomas More. So, the Renaissance right through to the early 19th century. So we're covering quite a period of time there. So if we could just reiterate that so people do know the reading. So we're reading from chapter 7 on page 53 right to the end of chapter 13, ends up page 102. So we're beginning with St. Thomas More, and we're ending with the feminine genius of Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, and the Bronte sisters.
So, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week. God bless you all.